So in 2.1, we mentioned domain and range briefly. We mentioned that domain is the x value and range is the y values. What we're going to look at in this section, which isn't actually out of the book, so you'll probably just want to title it domain and range, random extra section, whatever you want to do. But domain and range is we're going to look at how do you decide on what domain and range is when it's a whole graph versus just individual points. In 2.1, let me go back to it. In 2.1, when we did domain and range, we just picked out specific points. Now we're looking at a whole huge graph. No, not that huge, but a whole graph. Now on here, both ends of this parabola continue on in both directions. I just want to make sure you have that in your head. Now, here's what you want to do. When we're talking about the domain, and make sure you watch my pen, okay? When we're talking about the domain, what we're thinking about is the x values that we have. So we're thinking right here across the x-axis. So for example, at 1, I've got a value right there. At 5, I've got a value right there. So you're thinking in terms of my x values, when do I have a value? Now let's think about it kind of step by step. If we were talking here at -4, we're going to have a value at some point as this continues on. So -4, it's in our domain. I'm going to have a value somewhere up here. If I talk about -10, same thing. I'm going to have a value somewhere way up there as this continues up and over. Even all the way back to -infinity, which I can't go to because my computer screen stops me, you're going to have a value way up there as this thing continues up and over. So this goes all the way back to -infinity. It goes back as far as it can go. Now let's think about it in the positive direction, because then I've got value, 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 value all the way across here, and then it's pretty much the same thing. At, say, 7, I've got a value up here somewhere. At 20, I've got a value way up there somewhere as my graph continues up and over, up and over. Same thing all the way to infinity. So in terms of my domain, I always have a value. You can write it one of two ways. You can write it as all real numbers, or if you want to do a shortcut, which you won't learn completely until next year, you can write it as -infinity to infinity. That's how you say that. You write it in this notation. We're not actually going to write everything in this notation, but if you want to do this kind of as a shortcut, you can. Okay, now let's talk about the range. When you're talking about the range, you're talking about y values. So what do I have in the y direction? So for example, 3, I've got a value, let me use a different color. I've got a value both right there and right here. I actually got 2 of them. At, say, 0, this is at y equals 0, I've got a value there, and I've got a value there. So I'm looking for where do I have a y value. Now this one's a little different because if I'm talking about -6, I don't have a value. So this isn't going to be all real numbers because I don't always have a value for the y. I think it's basically going to be everything -3 and bigger. Here's how I'm going to write it. Y, because I'm talking about y values with the range, is greater than or equal to -3. So that means I've got a value here at -3. -2.5, I've got values. At -1.5, I've got values. Everything bigger than -3. Okay, now here's the thing with domain and range. It takes a little while to get your mind around it because you have to think about what's happening to this graph as it continues on. So it is a little bit hard to get your mind around. So if you feel like that, don't be too surprised. It's kind of normal. It takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to or whatever. Okay, we're going to look at two more of these. So, oops, I just skipped the middle one. So here's the second one, same as the other one. My computer program that graphs doesn't put arrows on the end, but this does continue on in both directions. Now on this one, the domain, I'm thinking x values. Same as with the last one, it's going to continue indefinitely in the x direction. Back here at say -12, I'll have a value up here somewhere. Same thing in the positive direction. I'll have a value over here, way up here at say 12 or so. I'd have a value up there somewhere. So my domain is all real numbers. Another way sometimes it's phrased, I told you you could do this on the last one, is -infinity to infinity. If you want to write it that way, you can. Now range, I'm going to be thinking in the y direction. I don't have anything until I get right here to -2. Then I have -2 and everything up from there. So like at 6, I'd have a value over here somewhere. At 8, I'd have a value over here somewhere as this continues on. So y is greater than or equal to -2. Okay, so let's look at one more. Now this one's kind of weird. I actually had to draw it with my pen on here because I didn't know the exact equation for this. Now I wanted to make sure we looked at kind of a weird one so that you had this in your head. Okay, so let's start with the domain. So I'm thinking x values, I'm thinking across here. Now looking at this, it's not all real numbers the way the others two were, because at -5 I don't have a value. That graph ends. So my domain's going to start at -4. So I have x is greater than -4. Now I did not use an equal to because it's an open circle. Then I've got values all the way along in here until 2. So x is less than or equal to 2. Now I put a less than or equal to because it is closed in here. Now I'm going to put an and between these because I need both of these to be true to be in the area I'm talking about. So I don't want to put an or because I would be saying one or the other of them are true but not necessarily both. I want my domain to be where they're both true, which basically means you're talking about in this area right here. Okay, so then let's look at our range, and this time I'm going to pick a color other than red. Let's do pink. So with the range, I'm going to be looking at what y values I have. So I start here and I end up here. So y has to be greater than or equal to -2. Now I'm going to go ahead and put my and because it's the same way. I want both of these to be true and less than 4. Alright, so that's domain and range. It takes a little bit of time to get your head around, so watch this a couple of times if you need to. Come in and see me if you need to, but you do want to make sure that you get all this stuff down.